This isn't a car video, this is a sewing video. We are going to be making that one. That is basically everything. I'm using a very old machine, but this has been a workhorse. Go in and out with your fabric like this. So you get a slightly better idea of how it's coming together. Next on the agenda are sleeves. One important thing to note with the sleeves is the pieces we're putting in, the plackets, are mirrored. This is because when you've got sleeves, the way the seams all line, the placket isn't in the middle of the pattern piece. So what I find helps is before I sew, I do cut at least some of the slit in the sleeve so I don't get them muddled. Also, when I lay them out, I make sure that they're laid out with the placket panel, this piece, actually pinned on whichever sleeve it needs to be on, because if you're using a fabric like this where it's not sided, it can be very easy to end up with two right arm sleeves rather than a right and a left. So I'm going to sew these together. I'm not going to go over how you do the placket again. We did it for the front and I really don't like doing them, so I will come back with some finished ones. Quick press later and the plackets for the shirt are done. They're a little bit more fiddly than the one on the front because they're so much smaller. But these work with the cuffs. When you've got a modern shirt, you sometimes have a button on this piece which is always kind of annoying and in the way. But this now means that when you do the cuffs, you've got your point for the split on the cuff. So it helps with that. There's going to be a little bit more gathering, a little bit more work, so we'll do the next stage. This one didn't turn out quite so well, a bit wobbly, but again, good enough is good enough. Our next job is the seam on the sleeves. So you have the sleeve the right way out. You can tell this with the placket, you've got the pointy bit, so that shows you which is the outside. And you sew it so that your raw edges are actually on the outside of the shirt, which seems a bit counterintuitive, but trust me, that's how you do it. Once you've got that, you then trim off the placket side of the sleeve. Now when I say that, what I mean is when you've sewn it flat like this with your seam, one side, because it lays naturally flat that way, one side will have the placket on and the other side doesn't. So you trim the placket side of the seam allowance down to half of what it is, which I've done here. Then you roll that over so that this raw edge joins your sew line, and then you fold that flat and then pin it in place. Then you top stitch that, and that gives you, one, a very good seam, a very strong seam, and it protects all the raw edges on one of the high wear areas of the shirt. So we're going to fight with that in the sewing machine. If you want, you can do that bit by hand. When you do the cuffs, you are sewing around this edge, but not around this edge, because that's where your sleeve will go in. You have 3 layers, so you've got your interfacing, and then you've got 2 layers of outer fabric. And when you layer these up to sew them together, this is your outside face. So you put your 2 fabric pieces that will be seen so that the outside is facing one another. On this fabric, again, it doesn't matter, it's not faced. Then you put your interfacing on top of that. One of the really common mistakes is to actually put the interfacing between the 2 fabric ones, and then when you turn them the right side out, you end up with the interfacing on the outside, which you don't want. Once you've sewn all the edges down, the next job to do is, on the very tight radius, you want to cut just straight lines with your scissors almost all the way to the stitch line. This means when you turn it the right side out, like so, you get a very, very nice sharp curve, and once that's pressed, that'll be better. To improve that more, there's quite a lot more material than I usually have on a seam allowance here. Just is. So I'm going to chop this down by about half the thickness that it is, so that when I turn it out, it's not as bulky. With the seam excess trimmed off, you have a much shorter seam, and you have the little slits that run up through to the seam there. So when you turn that out, it gives you a nice round curve. The style of these cuffs is that they have a rounded curve rather than a square one. So that's actually very easy to change. All you do on the pattern is, where you have this curved line, you just square it off. You can change the shape of these cuffs very, very easily. Both cuffs turned out and nicely pressed, and you can see how nice and flat they go. And by trimming off that excess fabric, you end up with very, very little visible on the other side. You can just see the shadow of it here. That's where the old fabric is. Now if I'd left the fabric the length it was, on this corner particularly you get a lot of bulk, and it's very, very difficult to get that area to go flat, and then you get these sort of bulky, blobby sleeves because the fabric's trying to push all of this area flat, and your distance here is much larger than your distance here, so it all just sort of bunches up. So by cutting the slots in, that allows the fabric to overlap, which allows more fabric to take up less space, and by trimming all that excess off, the amount of excess fabric you're trying to squash in is much, much less, so you end up with a much nicer finish. I've not decided yet whether or not I'm going to top stitch these cuffs. It can look very nice, but I want the shirt to be fairly soft, and it can make things a bit rigid, so I will decide that later because that's one of the last steps you can do. As with the back of the shirt, on the sleeves there's some gathering to do. So when you pin the sleeve onto the cuff, as we've done here, you'll find that you've got too much fabric on the sleeve. On the instructions it does say you gather this. If you look on a modern shirt you can see the same thing, and all you do is you put some gathers in here and eventually that piece will join the edge of your cuff. You can do it with pleats if you prefer. It can look quite nice. I'm going to use gathers on this one because that's what we're doing with this one. When you sew the cuffs on, you want to make sure that one layer of your outer fabric isn't being sewn through, and that your interfacing and your other, which I can't show you, your interfacing and your other outer lining fabric are the things that you're sewing through. Once you've done your gathers here, which I'll show you on the other sleeve, which I've already done, you want to pin everything down, and then as you sew just remove your pins. I found this is the easiest way to do this for me. You might have a slightly different method that works better for you. Also be careful as you're sewing that the length of the sleeve isn't actually caught up underneath here. If you're using a very thin fabric like I am, you don't always notice, and then you can catch it, and then when you take it off the machine you see that you made a mess. And as with all sewing, take your time. It's not a race, at least it shouldn't be. And you should be doing this for the enjoyment of it. If it gets frustrating, put it down, walk away, have a cup of tea, bit of a think, and come back to it. In a few hours, a few minutes, a few days, it doesn't matter, you'll get it done eventually. There's no need to reverse on the edge of these stitches. The actual process will be enough to keep everything together, because once you've done the seam there and you've pulled out the gathering thread, that's gathered a bit strange. The other cuff didn't do this. This cuff has just put one little gather there for some reason. I guess the fabric just wanted to do that. It's not a problem. It's just how this one's gone. I'm not going to unpick it. It's going to be perfectly functional. Now, when you do the inside, because you've got all these various layers here now, what you want to do is fold this fabric up into the cuff, and then this, which is your inside of the cuff, you roll that edge there and sew that down. You can top stitch this, but I've decided I really like how this looks without any stitching on. I've tried the other sleeve on my arm and it's nice and soft. It's exactly what I want it to be. So I'm going to go through on this seam and do this one by hand. I don't often do hand sewn seams, but I think this one would benefit from it. So then there won't be any visible stitching when I'm done. And this fabric is so nice to hand sew. The gathering on the other sleeve is a lot more ordinary and even. I don't know why this one went so nice and this one just did that. But it won't feel any different. The cuffs are the same size. You can't see both at the same time usually, so it's fine. There we go. One freshly pressed cuff ready to sew. You can see here with just how nice and smart and clean this all looks. I think some top stitching would spoil it, so we're not going to do it. To make my life easier when it comes to the hand sewing, when I've pressed the inside of this, I've actually rolled the hem and pressed that. So I just need to sew this edge and you just catch the inside of the cuff here. Don't go on this fabric here because your stitches will show on the outside, but if you just catch this edge here, then you end up with basically an invisible seam, which is quite nice. I found out why this fabric's so nice to work with as well. I did a burn test, which is exactly what it sounds like. You get a scrap of fabric, and in a controlled environment, like a stainless steel sink, you set fire to the fabric and see what it does. This fabric bubbles ever so slightly, which I suspect is something in the actual fibres, and smells like burning paper. The ash it makes is very smudgy, so that tells me this is linen, and that does make a lot of sense. The way it irons and the way it handles and behaves, it's a lot like linen or a very nice quality cotton. The burn test proves it's linen. If you go on YouTube and see Morgan Donna's channel, she did recently do a thing about burn tests. I'll pop a link in the description below so you can actually see that for yourself. But I'm going to hand sew this. I am not going to record that. I've tried to record hand sewing before and I've not figured out the setup for it. So when we come back, this will be done. About 20 minutes later, I've got both of these cuffs all hand sewn. So that's the outside, and this is my hand sewing, which is serviceable. It's just a whip stitch, I think it is, just to catch the fabric, give it a nice tidy clean edge on the inside, and then on the outside you don't see any stitching at all. It's worth spending a little bit of time. Just pop a video on YouTube and a nice cup of tea. After we've done the cuffs, the next bit isn't as you'd expect, putting the sleeves in. Instead you have to actually do the body. This is the last bit of sewing on the body really. You have to do this bottom hem first. It's quite tricky because the shape of the bottom of the shirt is curved, and this hem is rolled over and then top stitched. The easiest way I've found to do it is you fold the fabric over once and pin it for the entire hem, and then you fold it over a second time to hide the raw edge, and take one pin at a time out and put it back in. I did try to record it, but it's too fiddly. So what I will do instead is I will show you how this goes together. When you actually sew this seam on, you want to be as close to this folded edge as you can, rather than this edge, because with these tight radiuses the raw edge has a habit of walking out. So if you don't catch it right on this edge, you can end up with the raw edge poking out. It doesn't cause a huge problem apart from looking unsightly. So this is a seam where you really do need to take your time. But it is worth it when you've done. Also, as you get around these corners, it's effectively bias cut, so the fabric wants to stretch, but you can use this in your favour because you can sort of stretch it out slightly straighter, which allows the sewing machine to work a bit easier and gives you a nice finish. Don't try and pull it completely straight though, because then you risk unravelling the seam that you've actually rolled. As you go as well, if you see the fabric starting to poke out, just get your finger and just push the side of the seam with your finger upside down, and it usually goes back where you want it. When you stop the machine, try and make sure your needle's in the fabric when you take a pin out. If the fabric then shifts as you're doing things, you're not going to end up pulling it out of alignment. You can see here where the fabric's trying to bunch up, and this is where the bias stretch on this curve helps, because you can just pull it ever so slightly and it flattens out. And as long as you take your time and use your fingers to feed it through the foot, you should find that it all sews nice and flat. You may end up with the occasional pucker or gather on this seam. Don't worry about it. You're going to tuck this into your trousers. You won't see it. You'll get better with the next one you do. This curve's very difficult because it bends all over the place. There we go. And you can see how close you need to be to the edge of the seam. And I have got very close on some of the curves because the sewing machine moves as you're going around, but this is actually perfectly fine. This is the inside, remember, so on the outside all you see is that. And once this is pressed, it will look quite smart. The first couple of these that I did, I made a right mess of them. But that's sewing. The next step after doing the hem is to do the side seams. It's a little bit counterintuitive, this one. This is the inside of your shirt. So this side you see here is the outside, and you can see the raw edges of the fabric are on the side you'll see. That's because when you've sewn this whole seam, you then trim off half or so of the seam allowance on the back of the shirt. You then take the front fabric, fold it down, a bit tricky to show you this, fold it down to the stitch line and then fold that down again, and then you sew just there. That captures all of the raw edges and it gives you that nice top stitched seam that you see on a lot of modern clothes. If you wanted to do this easier and you didn't want this kind of seam, you use an overlocker, or a serger as some people call them, and that means then you can just serge these edges or overlock these edges and then sew the two panels together. This is a slightly more involved process, but it does make a much stronger seam, and particularly in this area on the underarm, that gets a lot of stress, a lot of movement, chafing against other pieces of clothing if you wear like a waistcoat or a coat over the top. So it just gives you a little bit extra security on the fabric, so it lasts better. We'll do the same seam on the arm eye, which is where your sleeve goes in. I'm not going to show that one because it's quite difficult. It's the same process, and honestly I just want to get this done at this point. Our last bit of machine sewing on the project is going to be the collar. You can do the collar in a couple of different ways on this shirt. You can either do it so that you have a plain grandad type collar with a removable actual collar piece, or as we're doing here, the more modern way of doing it where you just have them all as one. So the first thing that you want to do is make the collar piece. This is the bit that folds down over your tie, and you make it in exactly the same way as the collar cuffs, exactly the same way as the shirt cuffs. The only difference is the seam allowance on here, you trim it down a lot smaller, and when you do the corners you want to cut them at an angle so there isn't as much fabric in this corner. When you turn them the right side out, just use a blunt tool to poke these corners out and then press thoroughly. Once you've done that piece, you then have what's called the collar stand, which is interfacing facing fabric, then this piece, then your other piece, and you trap all of this collar. You trap all of this collar inside the stand, turn that the right side out and press it. Your button and buttonhole will go here, and then this edge will go onto the shirt itself. Easy. You'll have to excuse the poor lighting in here. It's winter, I've run out of daylight, and I was just eager to get this collar in and finished. I'm actually fairly happy with the end result. It's not perfect, you can see there the top stitch is, you know, it wanders a little bit. Also the stand of the collar, just behind my hand, it shouldn't step out like that. I'm going to fix that with a bit of hand stitching. All I need to do is tuck the fabric in and just sew it down. Similar story on the other side, just not as bad. I find collars very difficult to do. I'm not alone in that. I am happy though that the collar height on both sides is even, and the distance between this part of the collar and this edge is the same on both sides, if you ignore the stepped out bit. So the collar itself has actually turned out quite nicely. There's some hand sewing details to do on this seam here. It's a little bit complicated with all the bits. I like to just put a little bit of hand stitching on top of there. It just stops it from splitting or pulling apart. It's one of the areas of a shirt that's under a lot of stress. The cuffs I'm really happy with. The cuffs turned out really well. They're some of the best I've done. So I'm pleased about that. I'm pleased about this hem on the weird shape where it does all these curves and things. That's turned out very nicely. I like how the back's turned out. I think the gathers on the shoulders are particularly smart. They're not something I'm very good at. The top stitching on the bottom of the collar stand is good. I was going to hand stitch this, but there's always something over it, so I didn't think there was any point. And collar's high stress area, the machine stitching is going to be a bit stronger, at least compared to my hand sewing. So the last job on this is to pick out some buttons and finish off the hand sewing that's not going to be tonight. Normally one of these shirts I do them in like a weekend. This one has taken me the better part of a week so far because of all the recording I've had to do, but you get quicker the more you do it. I would like to get a tailor's dummy. I just haven't got the funds just yet, and finding a male one is very difficult. So that's on the shopping list. So far I'm very happy with this shirt and I'm looking forward to getting it finished. One fixed collar. I was going to fix this with some hand sewing, and after looking at the various seams and what I'd need to adjust, I realised the mistake I'd made. When you put the collar on, I'd started from the centre back because I wanted the collar to be nice and even and matched. The centre back isn't as important as the front. So where the placket here overlaps, you need to check that that meets up at the top, and then that gives you the button overlap and the gap for the collar if the collar has a gap. So as long as all of these various shapes are what they need to be, you'll be fine. So I unpicked it and then started by pinning this piece level with the front overlap and this one level with the back. I then pinned the centre back, and it was a case of going around, because this is also a slightly curved hem on the collar, which means the fabric can stretch and warp and just become very annoying. So once you've got the end pinned and the middle pinned, you then work your fabric in the gap in between, and usually it all falls into shape. It did quite nicely on this one. And once I'd done that, I could then sew it up, and I have a much nicer finished collar at the front without having to do a lot of hand sewing, and because I haven't got a mannequin to put this on, actually showing it all lined up is quite tricky, but I'm happy with the end result. So now we're just down to buttons and buttonholes, and that's going to take a little while because that has to be done by hand on this shirt, but all the machine sewing's done and I'm very happy with the overall look. I'm very happy with how everything fits.